Welcome back to another tutorial. Today we're going to be taking a look at practical cloth sims for character animations. Cloth simulations are a great way to add a lot of realism to your characters, a really great way to just kind of bump everything up to the next level. In Blender, cloth sims are a little tricky. They're a little slow. They're getting better, but they're not quite real time yet. So I'm going to go over some tips and tricks to make them a little bit more snappy, a little bit more responsive, and a little bit quicker. The first thing you want to do is determine the quality of the cloth sim that you want. And by that, I mean how close to the camera your cloth sim is actually going to get. For this character here, this is just going to be a kind of a background character, probably framed something like this in a shot at the closest. This is definitely not a close-up character by any means. The cloth sim doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be good enough that it can read from that distance as being actually affected by the geometry and the moving mesh. So to get started, obviously you want a character. So this base character underneath is actually from Mixamo. It's just this character here. And I have already animated that character using Mixamo, so I'm going to go ahead and turn off a couple of these layers just so things play a little bit faster. And you can see here that the mocap kicks in on frame 80, and he moves like that. So later I can parent everything that is connected to this mesh to another empty, and I can animate that going forward. So we don't have to worry about spatial displacement. We just have to worry about making everything work as the mocap is running in place. To get started, when you import your character, you're going to want to make sure that you set up a couple things. I like to have them in place. That doesn't mean that you have to have them moving in place. You can definitely have them moving forward, but it takes one extra variable out of the cloth sim and just makes things just slightly easier. If you're wondering how to set your motion capture to stay in place instead of moving forward, in Mixamo for a lot of the walking animations, there's an option here for in place, and that just keeps them locked to a singular position. So the first thing I did, when you bring the character in, this is the first frame of animation. And this will start on frame 0. So all I did was move all the animation keyframes to frame 80 and then copy and pasted them to fill out the rest of the timeline. And then on frame 0 in pose mode, you select all your bones, select the pose option up here, and then under clear transform, click all, and that will bring all your bones back to default position to T-pose. And then you add a keyframe. And to set a keyframe for every selected bone, just make sure that everything is selected. All you have to do is hit I on your keyboard and select location, rotation, and scale. And that will add a keyframe for those three options for every single bone selected. Then from there, I like to add the same keyframe at frame 30 so that the cloth sim has 30 frames to settle before the mesh underneath starts moving. And then I like a nice slow transition from the T-pose to the first frame of animation. And then you can go from there. That gives you room for the cloth sim to settle in 30 frames, get into position, and then be at a nice resting pose on frame 80 when the rest of the animation starts. This is a great way to avoid some of the common pitfalls of cloth simulation, which is meshes moving too quickly and the cloth sim breaking because it can't keep up with those animations. It also makes it a lot easier because you don't have to add the clothing in this pose. You can add it in a T-pose, which makes it really easy to go to somewhere like Sketchfab and just download a shirt. When you're looking for clothing on Sketchfab, though, you're going to want to keep a couple things in mind. This t-shirt, for instance, this looks pretty good. And for a background character, this would probably work very well. But if you select the model inspector option and click on wireframe, you can see that this is a quite dense model made out of triangles. That's not necessarily a bad thing for cloth sims, but it will slow down the process a lot. Ideally, you want evenly spaced quad meshes. So when you're looking on Sketchfab for your clothing, you want to find something a little bit closer to this. So you can open up the model inspector, wireframe, and there you go. This might look a little low poly, and it definitely is, but you can always subdivide. And it's really easy to subdivide clean quad meshes than it is triangle meshes, especially sculpted meshes, which is what the other shirt looked like. These will subdivide really easily, and the cloth sim will be just that much faster because everything is nice and clean and evenly quadded. So back in Blender, the first step is to define your collision objects. So in this case, we have the body of the zombie. I've chopped off the head and added my own. I'm not worried too much about the neckline that will be underneath the shirt, and the head of this character will also be a collision model. But for now, we're just going to select this collision model and we're going to make a little bit of changes just to clean things up. So back in Mixamo, you can see this character has a belt and belt loops. That's great detail for this character, but putting a shirt on is going to cover those, and that provides a little bit more points of failure for your cloth sim. Any extra geometry that you can get rid of, go ahead and get rid of it. Any intersecting vertices or faces will provide areas where the cloth sim could potentially bunch up and stick. So getting rid of those will just smooth everything out. From there, you want to select your mesh that you want to be a collision object. On your right-hand panel, underneath the physics properties, just go ahead and click collision. Now there's a couple of default settings we're going to want to change. In this case, I'm going to want to take the damping up all the way to 1. The damping essentially smooths out any errors in the collision. So if you have a cloth sim that sits on top of your model and there's some issues with like bouncing or any flickering in the geometry, this will just kind of ease that out a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and turn the shirt on so we can visualize the next options, and those are the thickness outer and inner. We don't have to worry about the inner too much because we're going to keep single-sided on, and single-sided just means that the cloth sim is only going to take into account one side of the mesh. It's not going to take into account the inside. And because the mesh is only interacting with the outside of the mesh, you can leave that on. We're going to bring the thickness outer all the way down to 0.01. And the reason we're going to start at 0.01 is because that's the minimum. So that's the minimum distance that the geometry of the shirt can get to the geometry of your collision object. If there are issues, we might have to bump that up later, but because the shirt is sitting over top of the geometry a good distance, there's not any area where the geometry mesh and its default position is going to intersect with the base mesh. I think this is going to work just fine. If you're having any issues though in your cloth sim and you have all these options set up here as they are, you might want to look at the direction that your geometry faces are facing. And to do that, you can go up here to your overlays and select face orientation. Blue means that the faces are facing outwards and red means that the faces are facing inward. This shirt, for instance, is blue on the outside, red on the inside because it's only a single face mesh. I have a couple of modifiers on here for when the simulation is done, but for right now with those off, you can see that it's blue on the outside, red on the inside, which is correct, and the base mesh here is blue on the outside. If you're having trouble with your collision, it might be because your faces are facing the wrong way. And to fix that, all you do is you go into edit mode, select the faces that might be facing the wrong way, go to mesh, normals, and flip. And as you can see, that flips those faces to be facing the other way. But in this case, everything is correct. We want that to be blue, so no changes needed there. So the first collision object set up, now it's time to jump into cloth sims. So I'm going to select our t-shirt. It's very important to make sure that your t-shirt is sitting over top of the mesh. You can do that by going into sculpt mode and selecting the grab tool and just moving the shirt as needed to make sure that it's not intersecting. Any areas where it's intersecting with the model when you bring it in on the first import, you're going to want to make sure you fix those. But assuming all of those changes have been fixed, you can go ahead and again, underneath the physics properties, for your t-shirt, just click cloth. Now, by default, these settings might actually work for you, depending on how far this character is. I'm going to go ahead and hit play, and as you can see, the shirt is colliding with the base model underneath. There's a little bit of fighting up here, but not too bad. I am assuming when I bring in the head model with collision, that will fix that up a little bit better. But as you can see, the default settings aren't that bad. From a far away distance, this will probably work just fine. But there are a couple things that I can see that I want to fix up. The first is the simulation cache actually doesn't go all the way to where I need it. So that'll be the first thing we fix. So to do that, under the settings for the cloth sim, you just scroll down the cache and just make sure that this is set to your timeline frame. I like to add 2 extra just to make sure. So now if we go back to playback, you can see that some crazy stuff happens. And that's because we haven't simulated the cloth up to this point. These blue frames down here are cached frames, but because we've changed something, when we try and play those back, those are going to disappear. So with these settings, you can see things play back pretty quickly. But there's a couple of issues. Number one is self-collisions. The mesh is intersecting with itself. So to fix that, it's really easy. You just click self-collisions. For this case, because it's fabric, I'm going to bring the friction up to maybe something like 16, and I'm going to bring the distance once again down to its minimum, and I'm going to increase the impulse clamping to 100. And again, that's going to do something similar to damping. It's just going to ease things out if there's issues. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play. And with quality of 2, you can see things play back pretty quickly. It's definitely slowed down a little bit, but it's definitely not too bad. And once this is cached, this will play back in basically real time. Another thing I'm noticing is that the cloth is a little bit too rigid. One of the ways to fix that is to start with a preset. So we can scroll all the way up on our cloth properties, and this button here, the 3 dots with the dashes, is our cloth presets. Click that, and you can see some options for presets. Now, these don't always correspond correctly. If I select leather, for instance, you can see that this definitely holds the shape a lot more. It's definitely a lot more rigid. It's a lot more thick. We'll just let this play out a little bit so you can get an idea. And this doesn't not feel like leather. It kind of has those shallow bends. It's definitely not, it's not folding in the same way that it was before. But if we select something like cotton, for instance, things are going to be pretty much as they were before. Now, part of that is because this mesh is unsubdivided and it's a little bit low poly. It's not too bad. There's a little bit of stretching you can see from where I use the sculpt mode to bring out the shirt from the collision with the mesh of the body. But there are some pretty big polygons here that will reduce its ability to fold in on itself, which is why we're going to use a subdivision modifier a little bit later. So if you're finding you want your cloth to be a little bit more thin, a little bit more flowing like actual clothing, there's a few properties in here that you want to change. The first is vertex mass. I'm going to bring that down to 0.1. That's just going to make it lighter. It's going to make it a little bit bouncier. It's going to be a little bit more, it's going to move a little bit easier with the inertia of the movement underneath. If you had a wind modifier in here, it would flutter a little bit more, for instance. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go under the options for stiffness and bending. So 0.5 right now is the default setting for how much this material resists bending. I'm going to bring that down to 0.2. It's just going to get a little bit more interaction here in the armpits. So there's a couple of issues that we're going to notice here, especially on the right side, on his right side. Now, a big reason for that is the quality settings. So going back to frame 0, I'm going to bring the quality steps of the actual cloth simulation itself to 10, and I'm going to bring the collision quality to 8. So generally speaking, I like to have the collision quality the same or just slightly lower than the quality for the overall sim. And that's just to speed things up a little bit. So with our quality of the cloth simulation set to 10 and the quality for our collision set to 8, I'm going to hit play again and just see how everything works together. So as you can see, this is, 4.5 frames a second down to 3.5-ish. 3.4, 3.3. Like I said, not real time, but definitely faster than things used to be. And this is already looking a lot better. You can see here under the armpit where the cloth is folding in, this is a lot more stable. I'm going to go back to frame 0 and I'm going to increase the object collision distance. And that's going to be the collision distance from the cloth mesh to the body. Things are working well as they are, so I'm going to bring everything a little bit tighter together. And I'm also going to increase the impulse clamping again to 100. And again, that's just going to ease up on some of the potential issues that we might see. So again, I'm going to hit play. Now you can see the shirt is sitting a lot more on the body. Things are hanging a little bit better. And as things are moving, things look very solid. This looks very good. Now, the reason I leave these to change to last, essentially, is I like to make sure that the overall properties for the cloth sim are working before I bring these down to their finest settings. Having the cloth sit directly on the body is the last thing that I want to be part of the troubleshooting process if anything else is going wrong. Same with impulse clamping. I want everything to work well at default settings before I essentially increase the quality. This is going to make sure that the shirt sits closer to the body, which is going to look more realistic. And this is just going to ease up, the impulse clamping is going to ease up on any potential issues, but it's not going to fix issues that aren't related to these direct settings. So I want to make sure that everything else is ironed out before I touch these. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and go back to frame 0, make sure that our cache settings are correct. Frame 0 to frame 282, which is 2 more frames than what we have set up here. And I'm going to go ahead and hit bake. And as you can see, this bakes quite quickly. Of course, this is going to be dependent on your hardware and your complexity of your cloth sim, the overall density of your geometry and the base mesh and everything that's interacting with it. But the work on behind the scenes in Blender to speed this up has been pretty remarkable lately. So this is a lot faster than things used to be. All right, so now that the cache is baked, we can play this back and take a look. And there you go, playing back at real time. So if you have any issues here, then it's pretty easy to go back. You just delete the bake and go back and change some things. But this is looking really good. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on our solidify and subdivision modifier. You're going to notice 2 things happen. When I hit play, it's going to look completely broken. And the reason it looks broken is because the cloth sim is playing after the modifiers. We go ahead and we fix that. Everything is going to be fine. The cloth sim needs to be before your modifiers because it's essentially affecting everything underneath it. So if you're adding extra geometry or complexity to your mesh and then putting the cloth sim underneath it, everything that the modifiers are adding to that mesh isn't going to be affected. So you're going to have some problems there. So go ahead, make sure your cloth sim is the first in your modifier stack and everything will be fine. And just like that, you've got a cloth sim. Now for the final video, I would be adding the head back in. The head is a collision object, but it's not going to be intersecting with the cloth right now. I just did the bake based off of the body mesh. So I'm going to go to frame 0, select the cloth sim, scroll down, delete the bake, and with the head selected, make sure that all my settings look nice and good. Go back to the cloth sim and bake. This is a really good troubleshooting technique as well. If you have multiple interacting collision objects and you're experiencing any problems, go ahead and turn them off one by one, do a quick bake. You don't have to do the full bake of your timeline either. I've done tests where I only do like frame 1 to 60, or I do frame like 1 to like 160, but only export 60 to 160 as like a test video. So here I have 6 test videos for this cloth sim that I did yesterday when I was working on this. If I open this up, you can see this is version 1, really low sample. And this was a different motion capture animation, but I just wanted to make sure that everything was kind of working. It was moving a little bit too slowly, so I went ahead and changed the animation. In number 2, you can see things are working quite well. This is also a test for some rips in the clothing and like material settings and things like that. He's looking a little bit too clean in that one. So in the next one, dirty him up, add a lot more holes. And as you can see, this is a lot higher sample, but it's only, I think it's only like 30 frames or so. And that's just to get an idea of how things are moving. And I purposely, when I rendered this, made sure it was a frame where his shoulders fall, right? Here you can see right here. That movement down is going to be the hardest part for the cloth sim to work around. And essentially that's just because everything underneath is moving so quickly. Cloth sims work better when the collision objects are moving slowly. You know, it's less for the computer to compute. But because I wanted this to be, you know, kind of like this jerking motion, this like kind of sickly twitching, you know, thing, this injured walk worked really well for that. Needed to make sure the cloth simulation also worked. The next simulation was a workbench render, and that was just to make sure that the material was kind of working as expected. This might be a little bit too thick, and I think I changed that. Might have done that on this one. Yeah, it looks like I did. You can see that there's a little bit of weird interaction down here where his leg moves up. It's not too bad though, and from the distance we're going to be filming at, this is working really well. And then last night I did a high quality render of the entire thing just to get an idea of how everything was moving together. The one thing I did notice, however, and this has nothing to do with cloth sim, is this right wrist was janked. I don't know what's going on here. It's all thick and weird. So when I woke up this morning, I thinned that out in sculpt mode. Thinned it out a little bit more than it needed to be. But, you know, this is an emaciated, infected character, so it kind of works out. So now that the cloth sim is done, and the head is in place, we can go ahead and we can play that back. And look at that, 22 frames a second. Things are moving nice and smoothly. Cloth sims, like I said, are a really great way to add realism to your shots. This is something that, because it's required extra steps, because it's a little bit more complicated, and because the Blender tools aren't as good as a lot of the other tools out there, like Marvelous Designer or Houdini, this can be an overlooked feature for sure. But there's just a couple things you want to keep in mind when you're making cloth sims to really get the best out of what you're working with. Just make sure you're using well-spaced quadded geometry, ideally on both the mesh that the shirt or the cloth is interacting with and the cloth itself, but most importantly, the cloth simulation object to be evenly spaced quadded geometry. You want to make sure that your collision settings are set up correctly and to make sure you understand what the properties under the collision means. And lastly, but potentially most importantly, is keeping in mind that because these are not the best tools out there, you might have to temper your expectations slightly. If you want like a marquee shot of a cloth simulation, you can definitely do that. In fact, I've recently made a shot of a waving flag. This is a cloth sim done in Blender. But if you go in with the right expectations in mind and you know what you're doing, you can get some pretty good results out of it. So once again, I want to thank you all for dropping by and taking the time to watch this. I hope it helped. If you have any suggestions or any tips and tricks that you think would help with this entire process, leave them in the comments below. Like I always say, I'm still learning this as well. And the more information that's out there, the better. And there's also a really good chance that I misunderstood some of the options or that I just don't know some of the other settings. Blender is an incredibly deep program, and even getting into something like this, there's hundreds of potential variables that can either trip you up or make this process go smoothly. So if you have any of those tips and tricks, make sure you leave them in the comments down below. And until next time, have a great day. See ya.